So, in the last mini lecture, we talked a bit about some of the preconditions for the rise of gay liberation and some early moments of resistance, both informal and formal, to police harassment and various forms of discrimination of queer and trans community members. And so, in this lecture, what I will do is I'll speak a bit more about the kind of a traditional narrative of the emergence of gay liberation and also some of the um, material and political manifestations of gay liberation in the late 1960s and first half of the 1970s. So, the incident that is often understood as inaugurating kind of modern LGBT politics was gay liberation, and in particular, what is understood in varying communities as the Stonewall Rebellion, riot, or uprising. And I'll have a number of things to say about the distinctions between all of those terms in a moment. So, what is or was the Stonewall Rebellion? So, the Stonewall Rebellion was a political contestation that occurred at a particular venue on June 28th and 29th, 1969. And the particular venue was the Stonewall Inn. So, what was the Stonewall Inn? It was a bar located in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. Greenwich Village having for decades been associated with a kind of queer and trans community building. And this was a bar that was actually owned by individuals with kind of what at the time was understood as underworld ties or ties with the mafia or a kind of large crime syndicate. And the owners of this bar would essentially offer payoffs to local police officers and various contingents of police to prevent raids and closures. Because again, thinking back to last week, one of the really common tactics in this moment were various forms of raids on bars, on kind of gay and lesbian bars, right? However, the Stonewall Inn was a very visible bar in Greenwich Village. It was frequented, or patronized largely by a kind of white, gay, male, working class and middle class clientele. However, there were also a number of people of color and also people of color, women, and various forms of gender transgressors, right, or individuals who were gender nonconforming. And so, on the evening of June 28th, 1969, something fairly ordinary happened at the bar, which is that there was a raid. Police entered the facility, sought to arrest a number of people, right? Took them out, attempted to take them outside and put them in the paddy wagon. And, the story of kind of sequence and what exactly happens next is a bit murky, right? Because there are multiple perspectives. But essentially, what we know occurred is that a number of patrons in the bar, community members outside the bar began to heckle the police and then begin to physically challenge them by throwing various things, pennies, empty bottles, right? And also by kind of physically confronting the police officers. The response, right, on the part of community members was so intense that indeed there was a moment in which police actually retreated into the bar and were barricaded within it. Additional law enforcement had to be called in, and it took several hours to kind of quell the uprising, essentially. However, rather than this being a kind of fleeting moment, as others in the past had been, this resulted in a number of protests night after night after this incident occurred. It resulted in the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, and really became nationally an important flashpoint for kind of gay liberation organizing. Now, one of the things that I would like for you all to do is watch a short video called "The Stonewall You Know is a Myth, and That's Okay." And one of the things that a number of individuals featured in this short mini documentary are talking about and thinking about is why in recent years there's been a lot of debate and contestation over who actually began Stonewall or initiated this particular uprising. And I want you to think about what is the particular import of correctly identifying the person or persons who began this particular rebellion, and also to think critically about who's being featured in this documentary and particular investments around particular narratives. Okay, so take a look at that video when you have a moment. I want to return to the issue of naming. So on the one hand, I mentioned at the beginning of this mini lecture that various individuals refer to this moment as a riot, a rebellion, or an uprising. And you'll notice that I generally use rebellion, but also uprising. And so there's a question about the importance of language and what do these different terms denote. So drawing on scholarship that's been written about, especially various forms of racial unrest in this similar or same time period, each of these words has a particular connotation. So a riot refers to a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd. Rebellion refers to an act of violent or open resistance to an established government or ruler. And finally, uprising might reference an act of resistance or rebellion, a revolt. And you'll notice that over the lectures for this week, I'll refer to Stonewall, the incident at Stonewall rather, as both an uprising and a rebellion. And I do so to largely emphasize the ways in which the various individuals who were challenging these various forms of police brutality were really responding to various forms of systemic oppression that sought to police their lives and also relegated them to second-class citizenship. However, I should note that there's a way in which Uprising actually more accurately captures, I think, the spirit of the event in that it both acknowledges the various forms of systemic oppression that individuals were responding to, while also accounting for the spontaneity of the response. This was not a pre-planned incident. And so I offer these three terms up not to necessarily say which one is right and which one is wrong, but to say that as we're thinking about this particular moment and its ramifications, that our language does have particular import, right? And can also help situate us and the text we're reading in the political significance of thinking about and remembering Stonewall in particular ways. So there's a question about why did Stonewall take on such importance? There are three potential reasons. One is kind of the general influence of homophile organizations nationwide, but especially in New York during the second half of the 1960s. This is a moment in which the Daughters of Bilitis and the Manishin Society, on the East Coast are increasingly engaging in various forms of confrontational political action. A second reason is the general kind of political milieu of radicalization in the second half of the 19th centuries. We can think about those other political movements, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, and the Black freedom struggle were increasingly becoming more kind of radical and what some might say was militant during the second half of the 1960s. And so gay liberation was certainly one manifestation of that. And then a final reason has a bit less to do with Stonewall in particular, but more so about the fact that Stonewall really was just one more instance of community-based resistance practices that have been taking place in various cities especially, but other places as well, for the last, 10 years or 20 years or even longer. And so in some way, it was really just the match that was thrown onto the kindling, right? The fuel and the interest in national organizing was already there within this kind of rapidly growing and increasingly visible queer and trans community nationwide. And so one of the things I'll turn now to thinking about gay liberation as a political practice, but I want us to keep in mind that after 1969, what we see is the kind of fairly rapid, I would say, development of three concrete and somewhat, I think, distinct political communities within three political communities, right? There's gay liberation, which I'll talk a little bit about. There's the emergence of lesbian feminism, which we'll talk about in week 11. And then we also see the emergence of gay and lesbian liberalism, which I'll have a bit more to say about in a moment. But now we'll turn to gay liberation politics.